So this is going to be a discussion of APA style for both writing research reports, writing APA style papers, and also reading and understanding APA style reference papers. So we're going to open up with just some kind of broad things to think about when you're writing an APA style. And I want to preface this entire discussion with the APA style handgun guide has gone through quite a few revisions. There may be subtle changes from edition to edition. So make sure that you do know which edition you're using. And I would strongly suggest that you actually Google or look up or go to the APA website of how to use the current style that is required. Generally speaking, though, these things have not changed across editions, and that's what I'm going to mainly focus with. So the first thing is an APA style research paper is going to basically have a set of sections. There's going to be a title page, which is going to be separate. It includes the title, the author's names, and their affiliations, and potentially contact information. The second page is going to be the abstract. Generally speaking, this is going to be somewhere between 100 to 300 words, and it's going to summarize the entire paper. And this is one of the areas that I think you really want to focus on when you're looking at APA style papers. Read the abstract. The abstract is going to tell you effectively what were the theories or constructs that were examined, what was done and what was found, and potentially might even briefly address some of the potential problems with the study. So generally, a lot of what you're going to be thinking about, an abstract is basically a Cliff Notes version of the entire paper. It's usually not enough to really look at the abstract if you're needing to do a deep dive and include the paper in your own research, but it's definitely going to give you a good indication of whether you should keep reading. So beyond the abstract, actually the next section is, the next two sections are not listed here, and that is the introduction and the method section. The introduction is not titled introduction. So it is on the page, basically page 4. So we have the title page, actually page 3. We have the title page, we have the abstract, and then we have the start of the introduction section. The title for the introduction is the title of the paper repeated. You're then going to basically, in that introduction, define what you're interested in researching as far as theoretical. So what are the definitions involved? And then you're going to go through past research. You should have past research on just about any variable that you're planning to manipulate. The introduction is not where we talk about operational definitions. It's not where we talk about samples. It basically is where we simply set up the argument of what we're going to do. Not what we're actually going to do itself, but the argument at a theoretical level. One way to think of the introduction is as a theoretical review of the paper. The next section, which is not listed here, is the method section. The method section is actually where we do the operational definitions. And the goal of a method section is that someone reading your method section should be able to effectively replicate your study. That doesn't mean you're going to list every single measure in every single item, but you are going to at least have a section for every variable where you define what it is, how you're operationally defining it, and you may include a few sample items, for instance. You're also going to include your participants, and we'll go more over the method section in a few slides. After the method section is the results section. This is where you actually put all your statistics. This is where you define your sample. This is where you actually go into great detail of what you actually found statistically and what the results were. So if we're talking about any of the statistical techniques in this class, this is where we'd actually be presenting the statistics on those tests. The discussion section is basically a broadening back out. We're bringing our methods and results into the bigger picture of what we covered in the introduction. We're also going to discuss any limitations of the study. And finally, we're going to end with a reference section. And each of these sections have specific requirements in APA style. The three big ones across all of these sections, whether it's the title page, the abstract, the introduction, which is again just the title of the paper, the methods, the results, the discussion of the reference, is all of it should be double spaced, all of it should be in 12-point font, and all of it should be Times New Roman. There should be no other font size, or spacing used throughout an APA paper. Depending on the edition you're in, you may bold, you may italicize various sections, but you're always going to be using the same font, Times New Roman, at the same size, 12-point, and always the same spacing. You may have to fight with Word a little bit on this to make sure that it's happening throughout your entire paper or whatever word processor you have, but this is one of the biggest things. So I often tell people, if you're writing APA style, 90% of it is your paper double spaced throughout with no additional spacing? Is it in 12-point font? And is it in Times New Roman? So I've already kind of covered this, but this is another way to think about how an APA paper is designed and styled. So any APA research paper is basically following the hourglass notions of research. We start very broad in the introduction, theory, broad open questions, and then we focus at the end of that in our research question, not our hypotheses, but basically the broad question of what are we interested in looking at. And most introductions are going to end with the actual hypotheses. So hypotheses are actually causal statements. A study may have one, it may have multiple hypotheses. These will often be numbered. We then get to the method section, specific observations. What are we doing to operationally define these theoretical constructs in order for us to do a study? We're then going to actually do the study, the observation. And this often is a combination of the methods and results section, but it's not necessarily a part of the paper. We don't actually write out the observation part. We talk about our sample and the methods, and then we talk about our data in the analyzed data and reach conclusions. So the analyzed data is the results section where we actually look at what we found within our study. And this is where we basically are defending internal validity. And we reach conclusions and generalize as we go into the discussion section. So what can we actually say about these results? That's going to be a discussion question. We start the discussion question with our conclusions. Based on our data, what did we find and how does that impact the broader question or generalize our specific question to the theory we covered in the introduction? And then again, we're going to address the limitations of our study, which we'll discuss in a few slides. So looking at this, internal validity is in the analysis of the data. External validity is in the discussion section as we generalize. Can we generalize? How can we generalize? What are the limitations of our study and the ability to generalize? And if we put this hourglass structure to work in looking at the paper itself, the broad-based questions is the theory, problem, past research, and summary with hypothesis. That's all in the introduction. The observation, we're going to at least describe what we did, how we did it, and the methods. We're going to then look at what we actually found in the results, and then we're going to reach the conclusions and generalize in the discussion. So this is a better list of everything that goes into a paper. So we have an APA paper that starts with a title page. The next page is the abstract. The third page begins the introduction. The introduction is not titled introduction. It is the title of our paper. So it's the same thing that we put on the title page. So it doesn't the word introduction. For example, if our paper was, let's say, the effects of depression on self-esteem, that would be on the title page. That would also be the top header of the introduction section. We're going to end that introduction section with hypotheses or set of hypotheses. We're then going to have a method section which describes our sample, so who was in our study, and those would be where we might have descriptive statistics of those participants as well. In other words, we're telling other researchers, here's who we looked at. Here's the average age. Here was the racial breakdown or ethnic breakdown. Here was the gender identity or biological sex breakdown. What did our population look like? Were they college students? Were they citizens of the United States? Were they elderly in a VA hospital? All of those are going to be in the method section. We're then going to talk about our actual materials. So within the method section, we're going to discuss what our operational definitions were. We don't talk about what we found, the results, nor do we talk about the actual hypotheses in the method section. The method section is literally a guide to other researchers to redo our study if they so were inclined. And it also tells researchers exactly what we did. The results section is usually the shortest section, relatively speaking, of the paper, because generally all it is doing is presenting the actual results of our analysis. We'll often construct the results section based on our hypotheses. This was our first hypothesis. This is how we tested it. This was the technique we used. Here's what the data said. Was it or was it not significant? And was it or was it not in the direction we were expecting or our hypothesis predicted? And then we'll move on to the next hypothesis, etc. In a paper with only one hypothesis, this section might be fairly short. We're then going to have the discussion section. The discussion session, and by the way, methods, results, and discussion are titled method, results, and discussion. The discussion section is going to be basically broadening it back out. Here's what we found, but here's the conclusions that we're drawing about what we found, how we think it generalizes beyond our actual sample that was in our study, and also how it relates to previous research that we covered in the introduction, how it supports or refutes those findings. And finally, we're usually going to discuss any limitations to external or internal validity within our study. Remember, all studies have limitations. And finally, we're usually going to summarize the results at the end. Knowing this, we can also play a little bit of cheating beyond the abstract when we're reading an APA paper. If you really want to know what they specifically were looking at, you go to the end of the introduction. That's where the hypotheses should be. Now, occasionally the hypotheses may be interspersed through the introduction, but they will be labeled hypothesis 1, hypothesis 2. So instead of reading an entire introduction, you can also just kind of quick read the hypotheses. If you're interested in exactly what methods they used, what measures they used, how they did their operations, you're going to mainly look at the methods. If you understand statistics, you may just go to the results section. And even if you don't understand statistics, you can look for the in English at the end of each section. So most results are going to start with a hypothesis, give you all the statistic information, but at the end, it's going to summarize it, quote unquote, in English. It's going to be plainly written. We found that the following variable did or did not affect the other variable, and this is what the direction of that relationship was. So again, you can kind of skip all the numbers and math if they don't make much sense and just read the results. If you're interested in redoing the study or expanding the study, you can go to the discussion section where they discuss limitations, because they'll often give you examples of how you could do this study differently to make up for some of those problems. So this is often a good place to look for as far as ideas for additional research in a similar area. And finally, if you're just wanting a little bit more of a summary beyond the abstract, you can always go to the very end of the discussion section and read that. After the discussion section will be references, also titled references. This is where all of the actual references used in the paper, all the citations in alphabetical order in APA style are listed. And finally, a paper may or may not have appendices that would include the actual methods that were used in the study. This is often most usually found in a paper that has a novel new way of measuring something, and they might include that measure as an appendices. Let's talk about each of these sections in general. Abstract, according to the APA style that I'm most familiar with, it's 150 words long. But note, it may be shorter or longer. Many journals have a limitation on this. So some journals actually set it at larger than 150, some at less than 150. And some actually require an abstract be a systematic abstract using a series of points. No matter what, though, generally speaking, if you're writing your own paper, 150 words is a good idea to kind of stick to. So if you're over 150 words, see if you can trim it down. Because an abstract is not supposed to be an in-depth examination of your paper. It's supposed to be a very short Cliff Note version. This is written sometimes after the results have been interpreted. I often suggest you write the abstract actually after the entire rest of the paper has been written, including the discussion. And generally speaking, what you're wanting to cover in your abstract is what was your research question, who did you do, what did you find, and why is it important? So basically, what were you broadly interested in researching? What effectively you did, only a couple sentences. We manipulated this variable to measure this variable. Who did you do it to? In college students with a size of the sample, like N of 342. What you found, so the most important finding, especially have multiple hypotheses. And finally, maybe one sentence on, and this really informs our understanding of depression, so why it's important. The results section is headed results, capitalized, bold, and centered horizontally on the page. And again, I would encourage you to check the most recent version of APA style to make sure. Sometimes they change how you're actually supposed to, whether it's bolded, whether it's simply centered. Sometimes it's on a separate page. Sometimes it immediately follows the introduction section, so there's no page break. Just check your most recent version of APA style to see what they're doing. The results section does not have to begin on a new page. That's according to the most recent version that I'm familiar with. What analysis you performed and what the IVs and DVs were. So again, who did you actually, so with the results, we're moving right past the method section. We're looking at what the analysis was, what was the IVs and DVs, and be very specific. So what did we manipulate, what did we measure, how was it related, and what statistics were there, and then put it back into English. So within the results section, stats need to be in APA format. So for example, if you're conducting a correlation, you report R. the degrees of freedom, and we'll discuss degrees of freedom in other lectures, what the actual test statistic was, the p-value, which is whether it was significant or not, and the effect size. And this format of what statistic, degrees of freedom, what the test statistic was, whether it's significant, and what the effect size is pretty common across all statistics. So for example, if you ran an ANOVA, you would have F, because a capital F represents ANOVA, a uncapitalized R represents correlation. You'd have the degrees of freedom, and notice that the degrees of freedom of ANOVA, there are 2 of them. You'd have the test statistic. Again, you'd have that p-value, and then you'd have that effect size. A thing to kind of keep track of here is again, if you're being overwhelmed by numbers, simply look at the p. If the p is less than 0.05, it means there was a significant effect found. If it's above p of 0.05, so 0.06, 0.21, 0.50, then it was above the bar, which means that an effect was not found, not a reliable effect that we can report. And we'll discuss this more in further lectures. And then if it was significant, generally a researcher, but not always, should present an effect size. Most effect sizes are effectively a percentage. So R squared and partial eta squared, which are the 2 effect sizes shown here, are both on a proportional, or basically 0.00 to 1.01 or 1.00 scale. So it's basically on a percentage scale. So an R squared of 0.04 means that this study was significant, but it only explained 4% of the variance. In the second study, we also see a significant effect, and it's explaining 8% of the variance. That means that in both of these studies, over 90% of the variance in our outcome variable was explained by factors not measured in this study. So there was an effect, but it was a relatively small effect. All statistics need to have their effect sizes presented, except for the Levene statistic if you use it, and we'll discuss Levene statistic later in this class. So again, I would actually argue that if it's not significant, there's no reason to present effect size, that you should actually only present effect size when you have a significant effect, a p of 0.05 or less. Finally, you should italicize all lettered test statistics. So small t, large F, large M, meaning mean, SD, which means standard deviation, R, which is correlation, R squared, which is the effect size, Cohen's D. Anytime you actually have something that's a statistical test, it should be italicized. So just get in the use of anytime an abbreviation is used in your results section, you italicize it. You should generally present your info in the following order. First, if you have any manipulation checks, and we'll talk about these in other lectures, you'd present that information first. Basically, this is a manipulation check is determining did your participants actually pay attention to your study. If you have any scales that you're reporting reliability information on, in other words, if you have a scale and did not already talk about it in the method section, this is where you'd be talking about what evidence you have statistically that your scale is reliable. You then discuss your inferential statistics of your main hypotheses, including indications of statistical significance. So again, a study might have one or multiple hypotheses that are being tested. For each hypothesis, there should be a test that tells you whether or not it was significant, and if it was significant, what the effect size is. After the statistics, you should put it into words. You should put it into English, assuming you're writing in English. Direction of the relationship between your variables. So in this section, instead of talking about cold hard statistics, we're going to say that we found a relationship between anxiety and depression, the expected relationship. As depression increased, so did anxiety. Or as anxiety increased, so did depression. And finally, you would end your results section if you have any supplemental analysis or statistics. Sometimes in the results section, we may actually look at a few things that we did not directly hypothesize. This would always be at the end of this section. The discussion section is 3 to 5 pages. Generally speaking, in most student papers, it may be much longer in a published paper, and also might be much longer if you have multiple hypotheses. The section header is discussions, centered and bolded, and discuss the meaning of the results and their implications. Did the results support the hypotheses? So basically, you'll go through each hypothesis. Was it supported or not? And if not, why do you think that it wasn't supported? What makes you think theoretically that it might not have been? Was it a problem with the study? Was it possibly finding some other effect? Discuss the practical and theoretical implications of your results. So not only what does it mean theoretically, how does this support other theories, is there practical uses for your results? Remember that concept that all psychological research has 3 goals, and many psychological studies don't actually hit all 3. The first one is to explain behavior. The second one, which is generally what we expect in most research papers, is to predict behavior. And the third one is to give us the ability to impact or control behavior. It gives us theoretical and practical implications. And again, you want to go back to the material from your introduction and include citations of how your study either supported or refuted those key studies. You should discuss the limitations of your study as well after this section. You don't need to focus on the limitations. They should be towards the end of your discussion, but make sure you mention the most important things that limit your study. Address issues of validity. And again, a way to think of your discussion section was there problems with internal validity? Was there questions about what you did? Was there potential alternate explanations for your findings that were not contained within your study? And then external validity. Can we think of things that would make it harder for us to generalize our study? And I have some examples of that going forward. So here's some examples of internal validities. These are just some possibilities. How your participants were assigned to groups. For instance, if you didn't use random assignment, if you actually used pre-existing groups, that would be a threat to internal validity. Possible confounds, so other things that could affect your study that you may not have accounted for. Did you actually set up the need for causation? Did you include that you ruled out all possible confounds, that you controlled a variable allowing temporal precedence, and you actually had statistical relationships? If any of these are missing, you can talk about that as well. The power of the study, and we'll discuss power a little bit in other lectures, but how powerful was it for your study to be able to detect? And power is one of those seesaw things. The more powerful a study, usually the higher the internal validity, but also the more powerful a study, the more fake it is, the less like it is the real world, which means that it starts to suffer from external validity. We can talk about construct validity. Do we have a problem defining our constructs, or is it possible that our participants were looking at our constructs differently than we had hoped? Experimental realism. So how realistic was the study? An example that pops to my mind is one of the first studies that I ever participated in as an undergraduate was actually a study on marijuana. And they brought us into basically a research lab. And in that research lab, we were sitting, it was very clear that we were in an experimental setting, and we were given a oral dosing of THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, and then they looked at the effects it had on our reaction times. Now, some of us actually got a placebo, but we all got basically an edible. It was obvious we were in an experiment. It was obvious what was going on, and it was obvious that some of us were experiencing, whether it was correct or not, the effects of the drug, and some of us weren't. I then later in my career as a graduate student agreed to participate in a study that again was on marijuana. In this one, they actually brought us into a room that honestly looked like a 1960s drug den. It was covered in lava lamps and blacklight posters of Jimi Hendrix. There was beanbags on the floor. There was Led Zeppelin playing on the stereo, and they actually had us smoke marijuana. And then they did their various questions of us afterwards. So of those two studies, the first one did not have very much experimental realism. The second one actually did. Was it actually smoking pot in your home? No, it was not. But it was closer to that possible reality. Maybe kind of a, in my opinion, drug-induced belief of what someone's room would look like that smokes marijuana, but there it was. We can talk about error variance. We can get into statistics. We can talk about the reliability of our measure. Maybe one of our measures was supposed to be a highly reliable and ended up in this sample not being. Experimental bias. Did our experimenter actually know what we were looking for? This is often called a single or double blind study. So a single blind study means that the participants have no idea which condition they're in. A double blind study means also the experimenters don't know which condition they're in. And experimenters can subtly affect the results if they know what's going on. If I know this is a control group and I know another group is the experimental group, and we're looking for an impact in the experimental group, I might treat those two groups unconsciously somewhat different. Did the study set up demand characteristics? And this often goes hand in hand with power. So the more powerful a study is, most likely the more demand characteristics they are. And demand characteristics are basically we are communicating to our participants what we expect them to do. When we look at external validity, there are some possibilities here definitely to talk about. One of them is participant selection. So who were the participants and what were their limitations? For example, if everyone in my study was between ages 18 and 19 and they were all college students, that means it might be harder to generalize this study to say 9-year-old kids in an inner city setting. Mundane realism. So this is kind of the flip side of experimental realism. Did I have mundane realism? And mundane realism refers to us actually doing studies in the field. So a lot of research studies are not going to be very high in mundane realism. Would I find the same effect with people that don't know they're in an experiment? How representational is that sample? And that kind of goes to participant selection again. And generalizing to which particular situations or populations. One of the ways to think of external validity, and we talk about this in a different lecture, is basically that all studies are bound by time, operations, and participants. So those are things we can think about. Even if we did everything right, are we going to find the same thing in 10 or 20 years? That's the time. Are you going to find the same thing if we measure things differently or we manipulate things differently? That's the operations. And are we going to find the same thing in different populations, different places of the world? That's basically the population or the sample that we have. All of those are ripe for discussing potential limitations. Now, a discussion section does not need to address every single one of these points. In fact, many of them are only going to address a few. But these are just some examples that you can draw from when writing your discussion session. You should also discuss future directions of your research. Give a few concrete ways to improve your study based on your review of the limitations to make the study more useful if someone wants to look at the same constructs. In other words, how would you do this study differently if you were going to do it again? And you're going to end with the conclusion. So I didn't really talk much about the methods section in this particular review. I do want to just briefly talk about that. We talk about it separately in other slides, but it is also equally important, and we'll talk about that as well in other lectures. Final thing I want to talk about is the reference section. Make sure that anything that's cited in text, and there's two general ways you can cite something in text. You can list the authors, last names, and then what they found with the date of the study in parentheses. So if, for example, if I was citing Nadler and Stockdale from 2009, I would say Nadler and Stockdale, parentheses, 2009, parentheses, found, and then I would give the information. And then I would make sure that in my reference section, there was the full reference for that Nadler and Stockdale 2009 paper. The other thing is I can just simply talk about what was found. Men are more likely to harass of other men. I'm not even sure what that means. That's a bad sentence. But anyway, that could be from the Nadler and Stockdale paper. In this case, if I'm not specifically listing the authors in my description, I would have the parentheses, the names of the authors, and I'd use an ampersand symbol instead of the word and, a comma, and the date. Note that generally most APA styles will have a limitation on how many authors to list. The current edition that I'm familiar with, if it's more than 5, you would list the first author, comma, et al, period, comma, and then the date. One of the things you can look at is I have a link to the OWL at Purdue.com. They maintain a very good set of references for using APA style in the most current edition. I suggest you look at that, especially if you're looking at how do I cite something in APA style. So I have a sample reference section here. The way that you cite actual books and academic articles is fairly straightforward, but a lot of times we might be citing a Wikipedia page, we might be citing a web page, we might be citing a conference presentation. Any of those, just make sure that you Google something to the degree of, in the most recent APA style, how do I cite, and then insert whatever you're looking at. How do I cite a YouTube video? How do I cite a Wikipedia page? How do I cite a web page? All of those are going to give you those references that are going to get you closer to what actually the reference page should look like. Hopefully this is helpful. There are other resources on APA style. A part of this class is not actually writing an APA style paper, but it is actually understanding them, understanding how to write them, learning about them, and also it is an extremely useful skill to be able to navigate APA style research papers. Hopefully this has been of help, and thank you very much for listening.